The sky is on fire, and George Preddy is alone. 8,000 feet below him, 32B, 17 flying fortresses lumber through broken cloud over central Germany. Their formation ragged, their escorts gone. Their crews unaware that the man now standing between them and destruction is a single 25-year-old from Greensboro, North Carolina, flying without a wingman, without radio contact with his flight, with fuel gauges that are reading numbers he is choosing not to look at. It is August 6, 1944. The target is Magdeburg, and above the bombers, what should be empty airspace is not empty. There are Bf-109s up here. Not 2, not 4. The pre-mission intelligence said light opposition, scattered interception, possibly none at all. The intelligence was wrong. The Messerschmitts come out of a cloud bank in a loose gaggle. The standard Staffel intercept formation, 12 aircraft descending in a long curving arc toward the unprotected bombers below. Their pilots are Reichsverteidigung, home defense, men who have been scrambled from Erfurt Bindersleben and are flying their own soil. They know this airspace. They have trained for exactly this intercept geometry. Their angle of attack is textbook. Their target solution is clean. What they have not accounted for is the blue-nosed P-51 at their 10 o'clock high. Preddy's aircraft, Kreib's a mighty third, carries the dark blue engine cowling that marks every fighter of the 352nd Fighter Group, the mark that Luftwaffe pilots have already learned to fear when they see it anywhere near a bomber stream. But today, there is only one blue nose in the sky, and they don't see it yet. In 6 minutes, 6 of these men will be dead. Their aircraft will be falling through the same German sky they have defended for years. And in the weeks and months that follow, surviving pilots from this engagement will be asked, by their own commanders and by Allied interrogators, to explain what happened up here, how 12 trained Luftwaffe fighters lost 6 of their number to a single American aircraft in a single engagement. Their answers, when they finally came, were not what anyone expected. But to understand what George Preddy did on August 6, 1944, you first have to understand who he was before the war found him. George Earl Preddy Jr. was born on February 5, 1919, in Greensboro, North Carolina, the second of 3 children in a family that had exactly the kind of modest, ordered life that made the coming war feel impossibly distant. He was not a large man, 5'9", lean, with dark hair and a quality that people who knew him described as quiet intensity. Not the loudness of someone who needs to fill a room, but the stillness of someone who has already decided what matters and is patiently waiting for the world to catch up. His instructors at Greensboro's local airfield, where he began flying as a teenager with money saved from odd jobs, noted the same thing. He didn't talk much, but he didn't make mistakes. He was good at flying the way some people are good at breathing, not just technically, but spatially, with an instinctive three-dimensional awareness that his instructors struggled to teach other students and eventually stopped trying to explain in Preddy's case because he simply already had it. Then came the accident. In 1941, before the war, before Pearl Harbor, before any of it, a car accident left Preddy with injuries serious enough that military flight surgeons flagged him as potentially unfit for combat aviation. There was a real possibility that the war would happen without him, that he would spend it on the ground, watching other men fly. He did not accept this. He pushed. He petitioned. He flew evaluation after evaluation until the flight surgeons had no defensible reason left to hold him back. And in 1942, First Lieutenant George E. Preddy Jr. was assigned to the 352nd Fighter Group, 328th Fighter Squadron, 8th Air Force, and shipped to England. By the summer of 1944, he had 18 confirmed aerial victories, making him one of the top active aces in the European theater. His P-51D, Kreib's a mighty third, bore the name like a piece of personality, a mildly profane expression of exasperation that had become, for the men of the 352nd, something closer to a war cry. His brother Bill was also flying P-51s with the 352nd. Same group, same airfield at RAF Bodney, Norfolk. 2 Preddy brothers in the same blue-nosed fighters, eating the same bad mess hall food, walking out to the same flight line each morning in the flat gray East Anglian light. Before a mission, they had a ritual, brief, understated, the kind of thing that happens between brothers who don't need many words. A look, a nod, sometimes a folded piece of paper, A letter one of them had written to their parents in Greensboro, kept in a breast pocket, to be mailed or not mailed depending on how the day went. On August 6, 1944, Preddy slipped one of those letters into the chest pocket of his flight suit. It was addressed to his parents in Greensboro. It was not mailed. He intended to carry it home himself. Most people will never hear George Preddy's name. That's exactly why we built the Combat Blueprint, a free newsletter for people who believe these stories deserve to be remembered. Link below. Takes 10 seconds to join, and you'll be supporting our channel. The briefing room at RAF Bodney smelled of cigarette smoke and damp English morning when the mission details for August 6th were laid out. The target, Magdeburg. Specifically, the oil refineries and rail infrastructure feeding the Wehrmacht's shrinking fuel reserves, part of the 8th Air Force's sustained campaign to strangle German industry. The aircraft, B-17 Flying Fortresses, 32 of them, drawn from the 1st Bombardment Division, bomb loads heavy, crews experienced. The escort, P-51s from the 352nd Fighter Group, in rotating high and low cover positions along the route. Enemy fighter opposition, light to moderate. Luftwaffe strength in this corridor had been degraded by weeks of sustained attrition. Intelligence assessed the main interception threat as concentrated further east, near the Berlin approaches, not over Magdeburg itself. What the intelligence had not captured, because the decision had been made only hours before, by Luftwaffe High Command scrambling to respond to the escalating threat to central German industry, was the reinforcement of home defense assets at Erfurt Bindersleben Airfield. An entire additional Gruppe of Bf-109G 14S had been repositioned there overnight. Experienced pilots, fully fueled, fully armed, rested. The Americans flew into Magdeburg airspace expecting scattered, degraded opposition. They found something else entirely. The first indication came at 1,137 hours when Preddy's flight lead, Captain John C. Meyer, called bogies 11 o'clock high. And then, half a second later, the correction no one wanted to hear. Correction, many bogies. Many bogies, break left, break left. The Bf-109s came down out of a cloud layer at altitude in multiple waves. Not the light, scattered interception the briefing had promised, but a coordinated mass scramble. 2 full staffel, roughly 24 aircraft, converging on the bomber stream from multiple vectors simultaneously. They had clearly been vectored to the exact location by ground radar. They knew exactly where the bombers were. They had altitude advantage. They had numbers. And they had launched their attack before the American escort had fully formed its defensive screen. In the next 90 seconds, Preddy's 4-ship flight ceased to exist as a tactical unit. His element leader, Lieutenant Henry Stewart, took cannon fire across his left-wing route during the initial break and was last seen spiraling downward, smoke trailing, over German farmland. He survived, barely, and by luck, but he was out of the fight. The second element broke hard right and vanished into cloud, unable to reacquire visual with Preddy in the chaos of the opening engagement. Radio filled with overlapping transmissions, break calls, aircraft numbers, position calls that no longer corresponded to where anyone actually was. Then, through the noise, came the call that changed everything. It was Meyer's voice. Flat, controlled. The voice of a man who has made a decision he doesn't like. All blue flight elements. This is blue lead. Fuel stay critical. We are RTB. Repeat. All elements. Return to base. Blue 4 acknowledge. Return to base. Preddy keyed his mic below him. 32 bombers were crossing their initial point. They were committed to the bomb run. They had no escort. And curving down toward them from altitude, regrouping after the initial break, were Bf-109s, 12 or more still airborne and functional, their pilots reorienting on the unprotected formation below. Blue 4 acknowledge. He looked down at the bombers, then up at the 109s. He never acknowledged. By the time Meyer's voice came a third time, Preddy had already pushed the throttle forward on Kripp's mighty third and was climbing to intercept. He was alone. He had roughly 800 rounds and 4.50 caliber guns. He had maybe 40 minutes of fuel. He had no wingman, no flight, no formation, and 12 Bf-109s descending on 32 B-17s. The math was irrelevant. The bombers needed a fighter. He was a fighter. The Luftwaffe pilots descending toward the bomber stream were not inexperienced men. The lead element of this intercept force was drawn from 3. Gruppe Jagdgeschwader 300, the home defense unit responsible for this corridor of German airspace. These were pilots who had been scrambling against 8th Air Force raids for months. Men who had survived long enough to understand the geometry of bomber interception, who knew instinctively where the escort fighters would be, who understood that a concentrated, fast, high-angle diving attack on the bomber formation was the one tactic that the Americans found hardest to answer. Their Staffelkapitän, an Oberleutnant with 14 aerial victories, had briefed his men that morning with quiet professional confidence. Hit the bombers fast, disperse, reform, hit again. The escort was thin today. The radar track showed no large fighter formation in the area. They were right about almost everything. What the radar had not resolved, because it was a single P-51 against a background of 32 large bomber returns, was the blue-nosed Mustang climbing hard at their 6 o'clock. The ambush, when it came, was theirs, but not in the direction they planned. Preddy was already tracking the lead element of 109s when a second group, for aircraft he had registered as climbing back toward altitude, suddenly reversed course and dove at him from directly above, out of the sun, the classic Abschwung, the German diving attack from a position of altitude dominance. They had spotted him. They had the angle. They had everything. He had approximately 3 seconds before their convergence. His hands did something that took less time than it takes to describe. He cut the throttle to idle, dropped the nose, rolled 90 degrees inverted, and pulled, bleeding 140 knots of airspeed in a single brutal maneuver that dragged Kripes a mighty third through an arc no BF. 109 pilot closing at 400 miles per hour could have anticipated or followed. The 4 Germans blew through the space where he had been, their cannon tracers stitching empty air, their closure rate so high that by the time they could have pulled to reacquire him, they were 800 feet below and moving away. He was now behind one of them. He fired. The BF-109 came apart. Airplane number 1. What he did in the next 90 seconds made no tactical sense. Not unless you understood what he had already seen in those split seconds before the dive that no other fighter pilot in that sky could have calculated. He had already solved the geometry for the next 4 kills, and the Germans hadn't realized it yet. The BF-109 was still falling when Preddy broke right toward the main group. There were 11 left. They were descending toward the bombers. The lead element, 6 aircraft in loose line astern, was 30 seconds from firing range on the rear of the bomber formation. Preddy had 30 seconds, insufficient fuel to climb back to a position of altitude advantage, and a decision to make. He made it by not thinking about it. He pushed the nose down and took the pursuit curve. In the cockpit of the lead BF-109, Oberleutnant Werner Doring, the Staffelkapitän, a man who had led 37 intercepts over Germany in the last 8 months, heard his wingman's voice on the radio. The words were wrong. They didn't fit the geometry of the attack. Einzelkämpfer. Ich sehe nur einen. Wie viel sind es? A lone fighter. I only see one. How many are there? Doring looked right, then left, then right again. His training said that a single fighter did not attack a 12-aircraft Staffel in a front quarter closing shot. His training was based on what rational men did. Preddy was not doing something rational. He was doing something that worked. He came through the lead element like a train through a fog bank. Fast, committed, already computing his next targeting solution before his current trigger pull was finished. The second BF-109 took a 3-second burst that detonated its fuel cell. A fireball. Airplane number 2. He was already past it. The Staffel broke. This was the correct response. The controlled defensive break, each pilot turning hard into the threat, denying deflection shots, attempting to sandwich the attacker. They executed it correctly. Against a single fighter with normal fuel and ammunition constraints, the break should have ended the engagement. But here is what Preddy had seen in those 3 seconds before the diving attack, the thing that made no tactical sense unless you already knew. The German formation had broken with a predictable bias. The aircraft on the northern side of the formation were always going to break south, because that was the turn that kept them between the sun and the bombers they were trying to protect. He had seen it in the geometry of their formation before the break even happened. He had pre-solved where 4 of those aircraft would be 30 seconds after the break was initiated. He was already in position. Airplane number 3 went down in a spinning vertical that its pilot never recovered from. Number 4, a Bf-109G, 14 whose pilot had 9 victories and had survived everything the 8th Air Force had thrown at him for 6 months, took a burst that destroyed his engine. He got out. He would spend the rest of the war as a prisoner. In the back of the bomber stream, the tail gunner of a B-17 named Memphis Dream, Technical Sergeant Raymond Kaskila of Minneapolis, Minnesota, had stopped shooting at the Germans because a blue-nosed P-51 had appeared from nowhere and was running through the Messerschmitts like something out of a film. He would describe it this way in a letter home that week. "I have been in 31 missions, and I have never seen anything like what this one fighter did. He was going so fast between them that I was afraid to shoot." But Preddy was not through, and the sky was not yet safe. Because below the bomber formation, lower than anyone had been watching, at an altitude that put them out of visual range of the escort position, but perfectly placed to ambush an aircraft that had just blown through a staffel and was now, briefly, predictable, there were 4 more Bf-109s. Waiting, stationary, patient. Preddy saw it at the same moment he saw the civilians. Not civilians in the traditional sense, but 64 American airmen in those bombers were not fighter pilots. They were bombardiers, navigators, waist gunners, radio operators, men in heavy leather and fleece at 28,000 feet who had one job and no way to defend themselves from a coordinated attack. When the second wave of 109s broke upward from below, their attack vector was perfect. Underneath the bombers, where the defensive guns had the worst field of fire, where the escort above had no sight lines. If Preddy broke off, if he rejoined the fight above the formation where his fuel and ammunition were better managed, those 109s would be in among the bombers in 45 seconds. He didn't break off. He dove. The maneuver cost him 300 feet of altitude he had no way to recover and a fuel state that was now genuinely alarming. His hands were shaking, not from fear but from the sustained physical loading of the previous 4 minutes. His body having pulled more sustained G-force than it was designed to sustain without a break. He pressed his left hand flat against the canopy rail to stop the tremor. He found number 5. The pilot never saw him. Airplane number 5 went down over German farmland 12 kilometers northeast of Magdeburg. He was now deep in the recovery, low on fuel, low on ammunition, and flying a predicable vector as he pulled out from the dive. His vision grayed at the edges. He had been in sustained hard maneuvering for nearly 5.5 minutes. In Section 5's midpoint, something strange, something that seemed, to anyone watching from the B-17s, like madness. He throttled back. Deliberately, he bled his airspeed in a way that, in a dogfight, is supposed to be fatal. You do not slow down voluntarily in the presence of enemy fighters. Unless you know something about the fighter behind you, that means slowing down is the only thing that will keep you alive. Don't explain it yet. Remember it. The altimeter read 14,000 feet when Preddy leveled his wings and let himself breathe. 2 seconds. Free. The kind of pause that costs nothing tactically because everything around him had momentarily stilled. The remaining 109s were scattered, their formation destroyed, their radio frequencies suddenly full of the kind of controlled urgency that Luftwaffe controllers tried to hide and couldn't. He was running on nothing. Not nothing. Literally, there were rounds left in 2 of his 4 guns. There was fuel enough to get home if he flew it right. But the reserves of the other kind, the internal kind, the kind that doesn't show on gauges, those were at their floor. He had not slept properly in 36 hours. The mission before this one had run long. His neck ached from the constant high G head movement of the last 5 minutes in a way that would leave him stiff for 2 days. There was a smell of hydraulic fluid in the cockpit that hadn't been there before the diving attack in Section 4, and he was choosing not to investigate what was causing it. He thought about Bill Preddy, flying his own blue-nosed Mustang somewhere in this same English sky, probably already RTB from a different escort mission, probably already in the debrief room at Botany. Bill, who had the same spatial awareness in a cockpit, the same quietness, the same stubbornness. Bill, who had watched his older brother get medically flagged and then refused to accept it, and who had followed him into the 352nd because if George was going, Bill was going. The letter in Preddy's breast pocket, the one addressed to their parents in Greensboro, written in the handwriting that people who knew them said was almost identical. crinkled slightly when he exhaled hard against the G-load of a turn he was making to reacquire his visual picture of the bomber formation. He thought about not finishing this. He thought about the order that had come over the radio. Return to base. That order was defensible. It was tactically defensible. He had already exceeded what any reasonable doctrine asked of a single aircraft against superior numbers. He had bought time for the bombers to clear their initial point. The 109s that remained were scattered and reorienting. Maybe they wouldn't regroup in time. Maybe the bombers would make it. Maybe. And below him, the formation was still intact. 32 aircraft, 640 men, and 1 BF, 109G, 14 that he could now see clearly, below and to his left, pulling along, high-climbing turn that would bring its pilot to a perfect intercept position on the rear of the leftmost bomber cell in approximately 90 seconds. The pilot had maneuvered well. He had survived everything in the last 5 minutes. He had found altitude. He had found an angle. He hadn't found what was waiting for him yet. Preddy reached for the throttle. The letter stayed in his pocket. He intended to deliver it himself. He went after number 6. The Bf-109's pilot, later identified from Luftwaffe records as a Feldwebel with 11 victories, one of the more experienced survivors of the engagement, was executing a textbook climbing intercept on the rear of the bomber formation. His approach was precise. His angle was correct. His trigger finger was probably resting against the safety guard of his 20mm cannon. He died never understanding why his closure rate was suddenly wrong. This is where the throttle back from Section 5 resolves. In the chaos of the initial engagement, Preddy had spotted something. The surviving Bf-109 pilots were using their throttle settings and speed as a kind of signature. In the fast reversal brakes, in the climbing turns after the dives, their aircraft were generating a predictable energy signature. They were flying at near maximum throttle, wringing every knot of speed from their engines in the defensive maneuvering, which meant they were also nearly at their maneuvering energy limits, which meant that when he slowed, when he bled speed deliberately and appeared, briefly, to be a damaged, struggling fighter, he was baiting. He was creating an apparent kill opportunity that any fighter pilot trained to recognize easy targets would respond to, and one of them had. The pilot who had accelerated toward the struggling P-51 in Section 5 had overshot him, blown past, become a target instead of a threat. He was airplane number 5. He never knew the trap until he was already dead. Number 6 didn't have the benefit of learning from that mistake. Preddy came down on him from a quarter deflection angle, 300 feet of closure in 2 seconds. Trigger held for a burst he calculated at 1.8 seconds. His sight picture right, his hand still, his body past exhaustion into something that might have been the other side of it. A clarity that doesn't come from rest, but from the absolute absence of anything left to hold back. The Feldwebel's aircraft came apart. 6. The sky went quiet. Not completely. The B-17 engines were still there, that deep continental rumble of hundreds of Wright-Art 1820 Cyclones pulling 32 aircraft across the sky. The remaining Bf-109s, 5 or 6 still airborne, their formation destroyed, their Staffel-Captain's voice on the radio, snapping out positioning calls that his men were either not responding to or responding to with positions that no longer made tactical sense, or withdrawing. The intercept was over. The bomber formation crossed its target in trail formation at 1,151 hours. 32 aircraft in, 32 aircraft continuing to the bomb release point. The crews in the rear elements, who had seen the Bf-109s coming and had started manning every defensive gun they had, were now watching a sky that had, inexplicably, been cleared for them. By one aircraft, one pilot, one blue-nosed Mustang, now flying a fuel conservation cruise back toward England with a hydraulic smell in the cockpit, and a pilot who had not eaten since for that morning. The bombers made it. One sentence of silence for the men in those aircraft who never knew how close it was. When Cripes' Mighty Third touched down at RAF Bodney that afternoon, the crew chief who met it noted afterward that the hydraulic fluid was from a cracked line in the landing gear actuator. The source of the smell Preddy had been choosing to ignore for 30 minutes. It was not a critical failure, but it was close enough to one that the crew chief, a master sergeant named Fowler from Tulsa, Oklahoma, reportedly said nothing for a long time after the inspection, and then said, "Sir, I'd rather not know how that happened." The mission debrief recorded 6 confirmed aerial victories in a single engagement, the highest single engagement kill total achieved by any P-51 pilot in the European theater of operations. United States Army Air Forces investigators verified each kill through gun camera footage, bomber crew visual accounts from multiple aircraft, and ultimately through Luftwaffe records recovered after the war. 6 aircraft, 1 pilot, roughly 6 minutes of sustained combat. The bomber crews were the first to speak. In the debrief rooms that evening, multiple crew members from the 1st Bombardment Division described what they had seen. Tail gunner Raymond Kiskila, whose account from his letter home survives in the 352nd Fighter Group Historical Archive, told his interrogator, "We thought we were dead. Then this one P-51 came through the middle of them like he was angry about something personal." A bombardier from a lead aircraft said he hadn't realized the escort was down to 1 fighter until he counted the blue noses in his crew's description afterward and kept getting 1. But it was the German accounts that carried the most weight. The Bf-109 pilot taken prisoner that day, the man with 9 victories who had bailed out when his engine was destroyed, was interrogated at a Yuzov holding facility in England within the week. The transcript, now in declassified 8th Air Force records, shows that when the interrogating officer asked how many American fighters had attacked the formation, the prisoner was silent for a moment. Then he said, "Einer, es war nur einer. 1. There was only 1. The interrogator noted in the transcript margin that he had initially assumed this was a language barrier issue and had rephrased the question 3 times. The prisoner's answer did not change. In the weeks that followed, as Allied intelligence processed captured Luftwaffe radio communications and after-action reports from this engagement, a name surfaced in German tactical debriefs. The 109 pilots who had survived August 6th had begun referring to the aircraft they had encountered not by its model designation, but by the mark on its nose and the nature of what it had done. Die blaue Nase, the blue nose, was what the Luftwaffe record keepers had, but in the informal language of Luftwaffe ready rooms, the phrase was more specific. Surviving pilots from JG 300 were calling him Der Einzelkämpfer, the solo fighter. It was not a compliment in the conventional sense. It was the name that experienced combat pilots give to something they encountered that fell outside their training, their doctrine, and their experience, and for which they had no other vocabulary. Oberleutnant Werner Doring, the Staffelkapitän who survived the engagement, was asked about it in a post-war interview in 1952. He had gone into American captivity in late 1944, survived the war, and was living in Cologne when a historian asked him about August 6th over Magdeburg. He was quiet for a moment before he answered. Then he said, "He should not have been there alone. No doctrine permits it. No rational pilot does this. But he was there, and he did it, and the bombers went through. We were not weak men. He was something outside the calculation. The civilians, the 64 men in the bomber formation who never fought back with guns, could not speak to the cameras." But Raymond Kiskila's letter, written 4 days after the mission and kept by his family in Minneapolis until they donated it to the 352nd Fighter Group Association archive, ends with a sentence that has been quoted in every account of this engagement since. "I don't know his name, but whatever his name is, I owe him mine. The United States Army Air Forces awarded George Preddy the Distinguished Service Cross for the engagement of August 6, 1944. The citation reads, in part, for extraordinary heroism in connection with military operations against an armed enemy. Second Lieutenant Preddy, with complete disregard for his own safety, single-handedly engaged a numerically superior enemy formation, destroying 6 enemy aircraft in a single action, thereby protecting the assigned bombardment formation from certain serious attack and demonstrating extraordinary valor in the highest traditions of the military service." 6 confirmed kills in a single engagement. The record stood for the duration of the war and has never been equaled by any P-51 pilot in the European theater. By that August evening, Preddy had 24 aerial victories. By the fall of 1944, he had reached 26.83, a fractional number because shared kills are counted as fractions in the official record. And even at the top of the American ace list, there are the complications of men who shared their victories rather than claiming them alone. He finished the war as the highest-scoring P-51 pilot the United States Army Air Forces produced. He carried the letter home. He mailed it to his parents in Greensboro from England that same week, without the context that would have made them understand why he had written it. They received it, read it, found it characteristically brief and characteristically George. Careful, affectionate, understated. They kept it. And Bill Preddy, when he heard the debrief from his brother that evening at Bodney, the full account, the 6 kills, the disobeyed RTB order, the hydraulic line, said something that was quoted by a crew member who overheard it, and that appears in the 352nd FG unit history. You could have just come home. George's reported answer: the bombers couldn't. George Preddy was killed on December 25, 1944. Christmas Day. He was chasing a Bf-109 at low altitude over Belgium when American anti-aircraft fire, friendly, mistaken, final, brought down Cripes a mighty third. He was 25 years old. Bill Preddy was killed 4 months later, in April 1945. He was 22. The people of Greensboro named a road after them. It is a small road. It is not enough. He was given wrong intelligence. The sky over Magdeburg was supposed to be clear. It was not. No one lost their career over that error. The men who flew into it had no choice about the information they were given. His orders changed at the worst possible moment. The voice on the radio was rational. The order was defensible. Every element of military doctrine supported it. He was one aircraft, alone, with degrading fuel and no wingmen. And the correct thing, the thing his commanding officer told him to do, was to come home. He did not come home. Not yet. An enemy that outnumbered him 12-1, that had altitude and formation advantage and home airspace, had prepared exactly the interception they were supposed to prepare. They were not weak. They were not incompetent. They were professional soldiers doing everything right. And they gave him a name. Not because they had to. Not in celebration. In the language of honest professional soldiers who encountered something their training did not have a category for, and who needed a word for it because the word enemy was no longer sufficient. Der Einzelkämpfer, the solo fighter. For the veterans watching this, you know there is a moment in every action where the calculation runs out, where the math of what you can and cannot do stops being useful, where all that remains is what you decide to be, in the space between the order you were given and the thing you know needs doing. You know what that moment costs. You know what it weighs. For everyone else, George Preddy was not superhuman. He was a 25-year-old from North Carolina who learned to fly because he loved it, who pushed back against a medical flag because he wasn't done yet, who disobeyed a rational order because 64 men below him had no one else. He wrote a letter to his parents. He carried it in his chest pocket. He intended to deliver it himself. He did. That letter still exists. It is in an archive in North Carolina. It is short. It does not mention Magdeburg. It does not mention the 109s or the bombers or the hydraulic line or the 6 aircraft falling through German sky. It says he is well. It says he hopes they are too. That is what he chose to write, the morning before one of the most extraordinary aerial engagements in the history of the United States Army Air Forces. He didn't need them to know how dangerous it was going to be. He just needed them to know he was thinking of them. We built a free newsletter for people who want to go deeper than the videos can. It's called the Combat Blueprint. First issue is already live. Link below. If this story moved you, share it with someone who needs to hear it today. Subscribe so you never miss these forgotten stories of extraordinary American courage. Who should we tell next? Drop their name in the comments.